Have you ever wondered who the very first people in Ireland truly were? Long before Celtic legends, medieval kings, and ancient clans shaped the island's identity. According to new scientific discoveries, the answer is far older and far more mysterious than most people imagine. Today, we are traveling thousands of years back in time, following the trail of Ireland's oldest DNA, and what researchers have uncovered is rewriting the story of the Irish people, their roots, and the extraordinary journey that shaped one of Europe's most unique populations. This is not just archaeology, it is ancestry, mystery, identity, and science coming together to reveal a past once believed to be lost. Let's begin. What we thought we knew. Let's start with something most people grew up believing. For a long time, the story of Ireland's origins was simple. The Celts arrived, they spread across the island, and modern Irish identity more or less came from them. That was the narrative in school books and documentaries for decades. But when you look at the actual science, especially the work coming out of Trinity College Dublin and Queen's University Belfast, that story falls apart almost instantly. According to research led by Professor Dan Bradley at Trinity College Dublin, the Celts were nowhere near Ireland when a first humans settled there. In fact, the earliest layers of Irish ancestry are thousands of years older than anything Celtic. This shift happened because geneticists finally got access to something we never had before: ancient DNA preserved in bones buried across the island. Once researchers started sequencing these remains, beginning around the early 2010s, the Irish story cracked open in a way nobody expected. What these early DNA studies revealed is that Ireland's population history is not one clean line. It's a series of dramatic turnovers, migrations, and cultural shifts. Based on research published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, PANS, the earliest known Irish DNA doesn't resemble Celtic populations at all. Instead, it belongs to hunter-gatherers who arrived more than 10,000 years ago, right after the last ice age. These people were tracking resources along the Atlantic coastline. They weren't farmers, they weren't Celtic speakers, and they certainly weren't building ring forts or carving ogham stones. And here's the part that's easy to forget. Until genetic work began, we had almost no idea who these earliest settlers were or what they looked like. Archaeology alone couldn't fill in the picture, but DNA could. So when you and I talk about Irish origins, the truth is a lot older and more complex than the Celtic story most people are familiar with. And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating. The real beginning of Ireland's human history starts long before Celtic culture ever touched its shores, and the DNA proves it. Unveiling Ireland's oldest DNA. So once scientists realized the Celtic story wasn't the starting point, the next step was to look for the earliest physical evidence of who actually lived in Ireland first, and this is where ancient DNA completely changed the game. According to research published by Trinity College Dublin's Ancient Genomics Laboratory, one of the first major breakthroughs came from a skeleton found on Dalkey Island, just south of Dublin. This individual, labeled M631, lived around 5,200 years ago. Her DNA was successfully sequenced in a study published in PNAS, and what it showed immediately challenged our assumptions. She wasn't Celtic. She wasn't even close. Her ancestry linked her to early farming populations who originally came from the Mediterranean. But then scientists went even deeper. Another key sample came from Ballynahattie near Belfast, where researchers uncovered the remains of a Neolithic woman dating back 5,000 to 6,000 years. Based on research conducted by Trinity College and Queen's University Belfast, her genetic profile confirmed something important. Ireland's early farming communities were not local. They were migrants, arriving from regions connected to modern-day Spain, Portugal, and parts of France. In other words, Early Irish farmers were part of the same broad population that moved across Europe during the Neolithic Revolution. But these farmers weren't the beginning either. Older discoveries kept pushing the timeline back. Excavations at Mount Sandal in County Derry and Hermitage in County Limerick uncovered remains belonging to Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. These date to nearly 10,000 years ago, immediately after the Ice Age. DNA from these early remains, analyzed in studies published in Nature, showed an entirely different genetic layer, tied to Western hunter-gatherer groups that spread across Europe after glaciers retreated. When researchers compared these ancient genomes to modern Irish DNA, the differences were striking. The earliest inhabitants had darker skin, darker eyes, and a genetic signature far removed from the lighter tones common in modern Ireland. So now the picture was becoming clear. The island's first people weren't Celtic farmers or warriors. They were seafaring hunter-gatherers who arrived thousands of years earlier, and their DNA laid the foundation for everything that came after. The first Irish were not Celtic. Now that we've dug into the earliest DNA, the next big question is this: how different were these first people from the groups that came later? And the answer, backed by solid genetic evidence, is very different. According to multiple studies led by Professor Dan Bradley and published in journals like Nature and PNAS, the earliest people in Ireland were not Celtic in any genetic, cultural, or linguistic sense. These ancient groups were Western hunter-gatherers and early Neolithic farmers, and their roots stretch back to places like Iberia, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic coast of Europe. This is where the story surprises most people. When scientists sequenced DNA from the Ballynahattie woman and compared it with DNA from remains at Mount Sandal in Hermitage, they found traits that challenged the popular image of ancient Ireland. Based on research conducted by Trinity College Dublin, these early inhabitants had dark hair, dark eyes, and medium to dark skin. These features match the genetic profile of early European hunter-gatherers who had not yet developed the lighter pigmentation commonly seen today. So if you've ever pictured Ireland's earliest people as pale-skinned, red-haired, or blue-eyed, the science tells a different story. Those traits appear much later. Another revealing point is the population size. Early Ireland wasn't packed with people. These first groups were small, mobile, and tightly connected to coastal and river resources. According to archaeological research from Queen's University Belfast, the Mesolithic population likely numbered in the low thousands at most. They were spread thin across the landscape, surviving through fishing, hunting, and gathering. Culturally, they left behind stone tools, shell middens, and simple dwellings, but nothing we associate with later Celtic Ireland. No ogham writing, no metalwork, no hill forts, no mythology carved into stone. So when you think of the first Irish, think of a very old, very resilient group of hunter-gatherers and early farmers who lived in a world completely different from the Ireland we imagine today. They're the foundation, but they're not the Celtic story. They're much older. A mass migration changed everything. Up to this point, Ireland's population story is built on hunter-gatherers and early farmers, but something huge happens around 2500 BC that completely reshapes the island. And when I say huge, I mean a transformation so deep that geneticists can literally see it in modern Irish DNA today. According to research published in Nature and led by Trinity College Dublin, a massive wave of people entered Ireland from the Pontic Steppe, a vast region stretching across what is now Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan. These groups are associated with the Yamnaya and later corded ware cultures, two of the most influential populations in ancient European history. So what brought them to Ireland? Based on research conducted by the Max Planck Institute in Trinity College, this wasn't a single migration. It was part of a sweeping continental movement that touched almost every corner of Europe. These steppe groups were pastoralists who traveled with cattle, horses, metalworking skills, and a social system that looked noticeably different from earlier Neolithic communities. Their arrival in Ireland didn't just add a new cultural layer, it caused what geneticists call a major population turnover. According to the genomic data, up to 90% of the earlier male lineage was replaced during this Bronze Age shift. That's not a small blending, that's a demographic earthquake. And here's the part that explains a lot about how modern Irish people look. These steppe populations carried genetic variants linked to light skin, lighter eye colors, and certain facial structures. So many traits that people casually describe as Irish-looking, blue or green eyes, have their origins in this Bronze Age migration, not the earlier Stone Age settlers. Culturally, they also introduced new burial customs, new tools, and metalworking techniques. According to evidence studied at Queen's University Belfast, this period sees the rise of Ireland's earliest large-scale metal production and a clear shift in social organization. So when these steppe groups arrived, they didn't just join the population, they changed it, they shaped it, and they left a genetic signature so strong that modern Irish DNA still reflects their presence thousands of years later. A mysterious Neolithic woman and a royal ancestry. Once scientists understood the massive Bronze Age shift, they turned their attention to something even more surprising, buried deep inside Ireland's Neolithic past. And this is where one of the most shocking discoveries in Irish archaeology took place, inside Newgrange, the world-famous passage tomb that predates the pyramids. According to a major study published in Nature and led by Trinity College Dublin's Ancient DNA Lab, researchers analyzed the genome of an individual buried at the very heart of Newgrange. What they found instantly changed what we thought we knew about Neolithic Ireland. This individual belonged to an extremely inbred lineage, the kind of genetic pattern usually associated with tightly controlled royal bloodlines. We're talking about levels of inbreeding similar to ancient Egyptian pharaohs, not farming communities in prehistoric Ireland. Based on research conducted by Professor Dan Bradley's team, this wasn't an accident. It suggested a deliberate elite system where a small, sacred ruling group restricted marriage within their own circle. This means Ireland's Neolithic society, the community that built monumental structures like Newgrange, Knowth, and Dowse, was far more hierarchical and politically complex than anyone imagined. These weren't simple farmers. They were part of an organized, stratified society capable of mobilizing massive labor forces to construct astronomical monuments aligned with the sun. And here's where it gets even more interesting. This elite lineage doesn't appear to survive into the later Bronze Age. According to the genetic data, the arrival of steppe populations effectively wiped out or absorbed this Neolithic ruling class. Their cultural legacy survived in the monuments, but their bloodline did not dominate the genetic landscape afterward. One more detail adds weight to the story. The Ballynahady woman, the Neolithic farmer whose DNA was sequenced earlier, shows genetic links to this same early farming population. This ties together the picture of a once powerful, Mediterranean-rooted society that thrived in Ireland before being overtaken by later migrations. So when we look at Newgrange today, we're not just looking at a burial site, we're looking at the remains of a forgotten ruling dynasty whose genetic fingerprints sit at the edge of Ireland's earliest farming history. How modern Irish people connect to ancient DNA. Now that we've looked at Ireland's earliest populations, the big question becomes how much of these ancient groups actually survives in modern Irish DNA? And the answer, based on genetic research, is a lot more structured than most people expect. According to the Irish DNA Atlas Project and multiple studies published by Trinity College Dublin, modern Irish people carry a layered combination of ancestry from the Mesolithic, Neolithic, and Bronze Age periods. But these layers aren't equal. Some are faint traces, and some are the backbone of the population today. Let's break it down the way geneticists do. 1. Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancestry. This is the oldest layer, stretching back nearly 10,000 years. Based on research conducted by Trinity College and published in Nature, this ancestry survives in modern Ireland, but in small amounts. These early groups simply weren't large in number, and later migrations diluted their genetic presence. Still, this ancient signature is what makes Irish DNA one of the deepest rooted in Western Europe. 2. Neolithic farmer ancestry. These are the Mediterranean and Iberian-linked farmers who arrived around 4000 BC. According to the Ballynahady DNA study, their genetic contribution is stronger than the hunter-gatherers, but nowhere near dominant. Their impact shows more in cultural remains, farming, megalithic monuments, than in modern DNA. 3. Bronze Age steppe ancestry. Here's where things get interesting. According to genomic research published in Nature and PNAS, the biggest chunk of modern Irish DNA comes from Bronze Age peoples who arrived around 2500 BC. They introduced new genetic markers, including those linked to light skin, blue and green eyes, and certain facial features. This means many traits we think of as Irish are actually Bronze Age in origin. Later influences. Vikings, Normans, and British settlers left regional marks. According to research from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, RCSI, these influences are strongest along the eastern coast, but don't override the older genetic layers. What makes Ireland unique is that despite all of these migrations, the population remains surprisingly stable for the last 3,000 to 4,000 years. Modern Irish DNA still reflects those ancient foundations clearly. So when someone says they're Irish, genetically speaking, they're carrying a story that stretches from Ice Age hunter-gatherers to Mediterranean farmers to steppe herders, a mix that created one of Europe's most distinctive populations. What Ireland's oldest DNA reveals about the island's ancient history. Once researchers started layering all these ancient genomes together, a much clearer picture of Ireland's deep past began to emerge, and honestly, the results rewrote more than a few assumptions. Think of it like brushing centuries of dust off a forgotten painting and suddenly seeing the full image underneath. That's what ancient DNA has done for Ireland. 1. Ireland was populated earlier than expected. Archaeological digs at Mount Sandal in County Derry uncovered evidence of human activity around 8000 BC, and according to excavation reports published by Queen's University Belfast, these sites belong to the earliest confirmed settlers. This means humans reached Ireland shortly after the Ice Age, at a time when the island was still recovering from glacial melt. 2. Incredible genetic diversity from the start. According to Trinity College's genomic research, the very first Irish weren't a single uniform group. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and the later Neolithic farmers came from entirely different genetic backgrounds. One group traveled up the Atlantic coast after the Ice Age. The other migrated from the Mediterranean and Iberian regions during the farming revolution. So from the beginning, Ireland was a meeting point of cultures, not an isolated outpost. 3. Two major population replacements. Based on ancient DNA studies published in Nature, Ireland saw at least two massive shifts: the arrival of Neolithic farmers who largely replaced hunter-gatherers, the arrival of the Bronze Age steppe migration, which largely replaced much of the Neolithic gene pool. These weren't small mixes, they were transformations so big that geneticists can detect them instantly in Irish DNA. 4. Ireland's genetic stability is remarkable. Despite these early turnovers, something interesting happens afterward. According to the Irish DNA Atlas Project, Ireland's population becomes surprisingly stable for the last 3,000 to 4,000 years. Few places in Europe show this kind of continuity. It means the ancient structure of Irish DNA survived through invasions, wars, famine, and centuries of migration. 5. Common Irish traits aren't as ancient as people think.
Features like lighter skin, blue eyes, and certain facial patterns trace mostly to Bronze Age steppe ancestry, not the earliest settlers. This finding, documented in research from Trinity College and PNAS, shifts the timeline of what we think of as Irish appearance. So Ireland's oldest DNA doesn't just tell us when people arrived, it reveals a long, dynamic history shaped by migration, resilience, and surprising continuity.
The emotional power of ancestral memory. When you look at the hard science of Ireland's ancient DNA, it's easy to focus on the dates, migrations, percentages, and genetic shifts. But there's another side to this story that often gets overlooked, and honestly, it's the part that hits people the deepest. Because this isn't just data, it's identity, it's memory. It's the story of how real people lived, moved, adapted, and survived for thousands of years. According to geneticists at Trinity College Dublin, one of the most powerful things about ancient DNA is the way it connects modern people to lives that would otherwise disappear into silence. Think about it. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who arrived around 8000 BC left behind no writing, no languages we can reconstruct, and barely any tools that survived the climate. Without DNA, they would be shadows. But with it, we suddenly know what they looked like, where they came from, and how they fit into the human story. It's the same with the Neolithic farmers. Based on research published in Nature, these early agricultural communities brought more than crops with them. They brought traditions, burial practices, and even social hierarchies that shaped Ireland long before the Bronze Age. They built monuments that still stand, but DNA shows us the people behind the monuments, not just the structures they left behind. And that's where the emotional weight comes in. When you realize modern Irish DNA carries pieces of these ancient groups, hunter-gatherers, Mediterranean farmers, and steppe pastoralists, you start to see Irish identity not as a single origin, but as a long, layered story of resilience and blending. According to the Irish DNA Atlas Project, this mixture has remained stable for thousands of years, creating one of the most genetically distinct populations in Europe. It also reminds us that movements of people are not new. Migration shaped Ireland from the very beginning. Cultures mixed, bloodlines layered, and traditions evolved. That's not a disruption. That's the foundation of the island itself. So when people talk about Irish roots, they're not talking about one moment in history. They're talking about a journey that stretches back to the end of the Ice Age, a journey written in both archaeology and the DNA carried by millions today. Revealing the face of the first Irish people. One of the most fascinating outcomes of ancient DNA research is that it lets us put a face, or at least a close approximation, on people who lived thousands of years ago. And when scientists reconstructed the genetic profiles of Ireland's earliest inhabitants, the results surprised almost everyone. According to research published in Nature and conducted by Trinity College Dublin's Ancient Genomics Lab, the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who first reached Ireland after the Ice Age looked very different from the modern image of an Irish person. Their DNA shows they had dark or black hair, dark eyes, and medium to dark skin tones. These traits match Western hunter-gatherer populations found throughout early Europe. In other words, the first Irish weren't pale-skinned or fair-haired. They resembled the post-Ice Age communities that moved along the Atlantic coastline into Britain and Ireland. Then came the Neolithic farmers, arriving around 4000 BC. Based on research conducted on the Ballynaddy woman, we know these early farming groups carried ancestry linked to Mediterranean and Iberian populations. Their genetic profile suggests they probably had dark hair, varying eye colors, and lighter skin than the Mesolithic groups, but not the very pale tones we associate with Northern Europe today. Facial reconstructions from these genomes show softer features and Mediterranean-like traits. Everything shifts again with the arrival of the Bronze Age steppe populations around 2500 BC. According to studies published in PNAS, these newcomers introduced genetic variants that led to lighter skin, blue and green eyes, and lighter hair shades. They also carried taller height markers and distinct facial structures. This group heavily shaped the physical traits common in Ireland today. So when we talk about Irish looks, what we're really seeing is a fusion of these layers, a deep-rooted mixture of Mesolithic hunter-gatherer tones, Neolithic farming features, and Bronze Age steppe characteristics. These groups didn't just shape culture or genetics, they shaped the Irish face itself. What's powerful here is how DNA takes people who lived 10,000 years ago and makes them real again. It lets us see them not as distant figures, but as humans with faces, features, families, and stories, all connected in some way to modern Ireland.
What this means for modern Irish identity? Now that we've unpacked the layers of Ireland's oldest DNA, the real question is, what does all of this mean for the Irish identity we talk about today? Because if you've been following the evidence, you already know the Irish story isn't a single thread. It's a tapestry woven from migrations, replacements, blending, and survival over thousands of years. According to geneticists at Trinity College Dublin, Irish identity is not defined by one ancient group. It's an accumulation of many. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who first stepped onto the island after the Ice Age contributed the earliest foundation. The Neolithic farmers from the Mediterranean brought agriculture, monument-building traditions, and structured communities. Then, the Bronze Age steppe populations introduced the strongest genetic influence seen in modern Irish DNA, along with traits many people think of as Irish-looking. That alone changes how we think about identity. Instead of picturing one ancestral group passing down a pure lineage, modern Irish DNA shows a story of constant adaptation. Newcomers arrived, older groups lost dominance, cultures blended, and eventually, over thousands of years, a distinct population formed, one that became surprisingly stable after the Bronze Age. According to the Irish DNA Atlas Project, this stability is one of the most remarkable things about Ireland. Despite Viking raids, Norman settlements, British plantations, and centuries of movement in and out of the island, the core genetic structure of the Irish stayed intact for the last 3 to 4 millennia. That's rare in European history. It means the Irish today carry a clear echo of their Bronze Age predecessors, with deeper threads running back to the earliest settlers. And culturally, it also reframes the Celtic story. Celtic identity didn't erase what came before. It merged with older layers, languages, beliefs, and customs evolving over generations. According to linguistic and archaeological research from University College Cork, Celtic culture arrived gradually, not through a single overpowering invasion. So modern Irish identity isn't a straight line. It's a layered, resilient story that stretches from Ice Age wanderers to Mediterranean farmers to steppe herders, all shaping the island, all shaping the people, and all still present in the DNA carried today. A story still unfolding. At this point, it's tempting to look at all the DNA evidence and say, all right, mystery solved. But the truth is, Ireland's ancient story is still wide open. Every new excavation, every bone sample, every advancement in genome sequencing pushes the timeline a little further back and raises new questions historians didn't even know they should ask. According to researchers at Trinity College Dublin's Ancient Genomics Laboratory, the more they uncover, the more they realize how much remains hidden under Ireland's soil. Ireland's landscape, especially its bogs, caves, and stone tombs, preserves ancient remains better than many parts of Europe. That means the potential for new DNA breakthroughs is unusually high. Some scientists believe the next decade could reveal remains even older than the Mesolithic settlers we know so far. And that leads to some big open questions. For example, who built the earliest boats that reached Ireland? According to archaeological studies at Queen's University Belfast, Crossing into Ireland more than 10,000 years ago required advanced seafaring skills that we still don't fully understand. These early voyages happened before large sail technology, long before metal tools, and long before detailed navigation methods. Then there's the mystery of the Neolithic collapse. Based on research published in Nature, the farming communities that built massive monuments like Newgrange eventually disappeared as the Bronze Age populations took over. But why? Was it disease, climate change, social breakdown, migration shifts, or something we haven't discovered yet? And the Celtic question is still unsettled. According to linguistic and archaeological work from University College Cork, Celtic languages likely arrived long after the Bronze Age, but how they spread into Ireland so smoothly is still being debated. Was it trade, elite influence, a slow cultural adoption instead of a migration? DNA alone can't answer this, at least not yet. What makes all of this exciting is every find reshapes the story. Ireland's past isn't frozen, it's active, it's evolving. And with each excavation, we get a clearer sense of how many lives, peoples, and cultures layered together to create the Ireland we know today. In other words, the mystery isn't solved, it's just getting started. So now we come back to the question we started with. Who were the first Irish people? Based on DNA research from Trinity College Dublin, Queen's University Belfast, and major studies published in Nature and PNAS, the answer is far older and far richer than the Celtic story most of us grew up with. The first Irish were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers with dark skin and dark eyes. They were followed by Neolithic farmers from the Mediterranean and Iberia. Then the Bronze Age steppe migrations reshaped the island again, giving rise to many of the traits we recognize today. Across thousands of years, these layers didn't replace the Irish identity, they built it. A deep mixture of old and new, of resilience and adaptation, carried forward in the DNA of millions. And what's incredible is that this story is still unfolding. Every excavation, every new genome sequence pushes the timeline further and sharpens the picture. If you enjoyed this journey into Ireland's oldest DNA and want more stories like this, rich history, deep research, and mysteries brought to life, make sure you subscribe, like, and share this video. Your support helps us bring you more powerful, evidence-based history every week.